Welcome back to another episode of the Israel Connection. Ever since October 7th, Israel is at war. Things are unclear, very vague, and it is become increasingly more and more difficult to cover everything that's happening, but we're still going to do our best to provide that with this episode. Here we go.
Hello, everyone. Good morning. It's November 6th. We've already switched a month, and I welcome you all to another Israel Connection. Seems to be Israel at War edition, which we've just changed entirely the concept of these meetings. Well, I no longer just talk about the news myself, but I also encourage you to share your bits that you want to discuss with the group here and just share what you think about the situation. And I wanted to shift the focus from not just talking about the war and what's happening in Gaza right now, and what is the situation with the hostages that still continues to be the most important thing right now to focus on, and also talk a little bit about the encouraging initiatives and the hopeful stuff that we hear about coming from Israel and from here, and try to lift our spirit a little bit. I read a really interesting piece that says we just hit 30 days since the war started. We just hit a month. And on the Jewish life cycle, after 30 years, after 30 days, you go back, you uncover the headstone, and you move on. It's part of the mourning process of the first 7 days are the Shiva, the 7 days where we come together to support whoever is in grief. After 30 days, we are done with the initial grieving process, and we're switching modes to trying to move on with our life while still having grief in our hearts, which I think is really, really interesting because it also aligns very well with the fact that globally, worldwide, after a month, usually the time where the spotlight switches to the next thing, even for larger events. They usually are not being covered for more than a month, or they're gonna significantly reduce in coverage and move on to the next thing. It happens to Ukraine, it happens in Yugoslavia, it happens in whenever there was a world crisis. International media usually gives a month and then moves on. And I wanted to talk about this, about how we try, not necessarily to move on with our lives, but how can we incorporate Israel at war and what's happening right now with everything else that is happening that comes back to take place. And honestly, I'm not sure. I've heard that this definitely feels like a collective grief process, that all of us are feeling grief collectively about what's happening in Israel right now. And
one of the things that's really concerning me, among other things, though, is that how now the world seems to be turning on Israel due to the casualties in Gaza of Palestinians. And it was interesting. I don't know if anybody watched Morning Joe this morning, but Joe Scarborough, who's been very pro-Israel and continues to be, is just incredulous about the calls for the ceasefire. He said, nobody asked us for a ceasefire after Pearl Harbor or after 9/11. Why does everybody always ask Israel for a ceasefire when they're trying to get rid of an enemy? And I thought that was a very interesting perspective, because it's true when you look at it. We killed millions of people when we dropped the atomic bomb. And that's all considered collateral damage. And again, nobody asked us not to do that or not to take out the enemy. So, which I think is a very interesting perspective. And I wish I was talked up more in that frame of reference.
Yeah, go ahead, Josh.
To follow up on your comment, Phyllis, those of you who read The Economist magazine, The Economist came out with a very firm statement indicating that Israel has to finish off Hamas before there can be any ceasefire. And they've argued, and I would agree with them, that if Israel doesn't take this to that stage, it faces the likelihood of renewed attacks from Hamas and probably aligned parties. That is one thing that struck me. Another thing that struck me, somebody in my synagogue posted an op-ed piece by the president of Brandeis University, arguing that there are legitimate steps that universities can take to respond to what you could call unacceptable protests. There is free speech, and there is a point beyond which free speech becomes unacceptable, where you are threatening other students. I'm not sure I would go so far as to say I would shut off cries of "from the river to the sea," which he argued. But I do think universities are well within their rights to establish what you might call rules for conduct, and that students who violate those rules should be subject to penalties. And I'm just curious, has anybody been in touch with people who are active or let's say involved with either George Mason or Georgetown or George Washington to see what the situation has been there? I'm asking because, again, somebody in my synagogue who teaches at George Mason has objected to what the university has not done there. Any comments from anybody?
I can start, and then Jeff, if you want to add up, Zina, whoever's. So I'm in contact specifically with George Mason. I'm in contact with Daniel Novik, Rabbi Novik, who's the director of Hillel there. And he says that they're working very strongly to try and advocate for a new policy regarding viewing this as anti-Semitism, viewing this as something that puts Jewish and Israeli students at risk, and to try and change that. I know the same goes for Hillel and Chabad in George Washington, and I know that the Hillels are working on it. I'm not entirely sure that the board of universities are going to accept that. So that's a different conversation. There's also, yeah, go ahead, Deborah. You just muted yourself.
Am I muted or unmuted?
Now you're unmuted. Go ahead.
Okay, I thought David could maybe give a little insight from what's going on with the Hillels.
Brilliant.
Bring in an expert. What can I say?
Hi there. How are you?
So, Dean, could you repeat?
Yeah. So, when Josh has raised up the concern about, well, not the concern, but the comment about Brandeis president pushing an op-ed that tries to limit what is the boundaries of free speech, and to write down some rule of conduct regarding to how and when this becomes unsafe for students. And I'm saying essentially what our universities are doing right now to try and promote security for Jewish students in campuses and in general, to let people know that advocating for Hamas is not necessarily under free speech.
Yeah.
That's the conversation.
As usual, Josh is speaking directly to a critical point, and probably the most difficult point in all of this. Let me back up a bit. I'm by way of background, I'm a longtime member of the board of Hillel International. I'm quite aware about what is going on. There's an announcement today of a coalition of a whole group of the Hillel International Brandeis Center, who are lawyers, the American Jewish Congress and whatever, and two major international law firms, Gibson, Dunn and Crutcher and Morgan, Lewis and Bacchus. And what they are going to do is set up a legal hotline for complaints by Jewish students of abuse. Frankly, I think this is a really good thing, and much better than the rumored lawsuit against the Department of Education that I didn't think made much sense. But more to the point, there are university presidents who have condemned Hamas directly, and who have stated that language that directly threatens Jews, and frankly Muslim students as well, is out of bounds on their campuses. And they provide for resources, for the availability of resources for students. I include President Granberg of George Washington University in that regard. The president of George Mason just issued, I thought, a really strong statement to that respect. And there are a few others. Everybody's focusing on Penn and the elite universities. At best, some of them are playing catch up. Some of them aren't even doing a good job of catch up, but Penn is trying really hard, I think, with their detailed proposal for a task force. But they as to the question of free speech, that and enforcement of codes of conduct, and what the limits of what the line between academic freedom is and free speech and appropriate conduct is an area that has been under emphasized in many schools. University of Chicago issued clear guidelines about that 20 years ago, about the line between that and conduct. My alma mater has a statement on Johns Hopkins has a statement on academic freedom that is not quite as detailed as University of Chicago, but does draw a line between abusive behavior and free speech. This is going to be I think, a real issue on many campuses when some of the smoke clears off the current activity. With regard to protection, I know at GW, I know at George Mason, I know at other schools there is a close relationship between the Hillel and the university security, and actually both of the Hillel directors there. I haven't talked to Jason at American. I really should. They are very pleased with the coordination that they're having with their security, and they're working hard to help the students in a number of ways, including deal with it, as our Hillel directors around the campuses. The Hillel International people are tracking all of the incidents that are reported across the country. They've, according they categorize them by degree of badness, a degree of threatening, from the language of from the spectrum of the graffiti vandalism on the one hand, which does not threaten physical security, to those that do. And they're working with various administrations to greater or lesser degree to guide them through that. And there has been an effort there's been an effort over the last couple of years to educate administrators, not presidents, but administrators, about who Jewish students are. There's an appalling lack of understanding. And then there's a separate issue about recognition of the sensitivities and the Jewish students and the language. But there's a lot going on, and there's going to be a lot to do going forward. But on the basic immediate protection, there's a lot of effort to protect students going on right now.
Thank you for providing.
And maybe more than you wanted to know. Yeah.
Luckily, Deborah is on our Zooms, so you're in reach when needed, which is perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing, David. Josh, I hope this answers your questions and provided more information regarding specifically Hillel International.
Yes, thank you. If I can just follow up, I would encourage people to stay in touch with the Hillel foundations of their individual institutions, because some feel more comfortable, or some have reported more positive news than others. I know I have been in touch with my two Hillels at Princeton and Michigan, both of which have reported very encouraging comments from their schools, presidents and deans of students. And obviously, this is a time when, if you feel so inclined, a contribution to your college's Hillel Foundation would be very much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Go ahead, Gabe.
Hi, thank you. Just to come back to something you said at the very beginning, talking about coverage, I've been struck by what has been described as the double standard and the scrutiny given to things that Israel does versus things that many other countries do. And there are these huge worldwide protests for ceasefire, and no such protests about, say, Ukraine, a war that's been going on for a year and a half. And I think what's going on in Ukraine is in many ways worse because it was unprovoked, because it was simply a hostile attempt by one country to take over another. And whatever you think about the proportionality of what Israel is doing, certainly nobody can deny that they're responding to a threat. And the people who are demanding a unilateral ceasefire on Israel's part don't seem to be asking for anything in return from Hamas, such as releasing the hostages. And so it just seems in two different ways to be just out of line, making this demand on Israel, where the same scrutiny, the same protests are not directed elsewhere where they're probably more appropriate. And they're demanding that Israel do something which would endanger itself, where it's certainly plausible that if there's a ceasefire, if there's a humanitarian pause, Hamas will rearm. That's been the pattern. And demanding a ceasefire with nothing from Hamas, either releasing the hostages or promising, for whatever that would be worth, to cease hostilities and retract its stated ambition to wipe Israel off the face of the earth. I think it's just ridiculous to demand this one-sided concession.
I agree. I agree with you. And I can say even furthermore, right? This is not the first time we're seeing double standards when it comes to criticize Israel and trying to view it in comparison to other armed conflicts going on in the world. Specifically within the Muslim world, you can say that in Saudi Arabia, or against the Houthis in Yemen, they've killed over 500,000 of them. Does that come any closer to what Israel is facing with Gaza or any armed conflict in the world? No, but this is part of double standards. And if to keep up with Natan Sharansky, who was the previous chairman of the Jewish Agency, he came up with a 3D rule when it comes to anti-Semitism. demonization, delegitimization, and double standards are the three main Ds to follow in order to understand if some form of criticism is just a criticism about Israel, or is it actually anti-Semitism in disguise? And this type of double standards is anti-Semitism, is a form of anti-Semitism. It's modern anti-Semitism in a form of anti-Zionism. And this discouraging Israel from its legitimacy to exist as a country just because of its government, or again, or demonization, the Jews are this evil creature, is anti-Semitism. And this is just the basic the rule of thumb to follow when it comes to trying to identify something as anti-Semitism. Now, specifically about Deborah, you're going to be next afterwards.
I was just going to say, I heard a senator from Alabama today, a Republican senator from Alabama. She's apparently the youngest female senator ever elected. And she had gone on the bipartisan trip to Israel, and she was absolutely adamant that there should be no call for ceasefire.
That's encouraging. And I'll say that
it made me feel a little better that at least there's some support in Congress against it.
So that's where it becomes complicated. Well, everything's complicated, but this is why it becomes interesting, because it seems that there's two levels. There's the international media coverage of the situation, and then there's the political level of leadership and world leaders regarding to how they address the situation. On the media coverage level, it seems that there's bystanders, everybody hates us, and everybody's promoting ceasefire versus to just accept it as it is. When it comes to world leaders, the image seems to be very different. I'm not talking about the UN. I'm sorry, but from a personal perspective, the UN doesn't give a crap about Israel and isn't worth that much of attention. And you can see the sides that are aligning regarding to UN resolutions regarding to the situation in Israel. But when it comes to world leaders, the UK, France, Canada, the US as well, world leaders are actually supporting Israel and Israel's right to defend itself and not calling for ceasefire because they understand the complexity of it. On the media coverage, on the protest you can see on the streets, on social media, it seems that Israel is this big bad demon that hunts Palestinians for fun or something. And that seems to be like the two different spheres of how the world react to the situation in Israel. Now, I know that there were two really interesting initiatives that were going on very recently, made by the IDF spokesperson. They've created a 40 minutes long footage of Hamas's attacks. Very, very visual footages they took from Hamas terrorists' body cameras, from stuff they gathered online, and actual footage of the butchers of October 7th. They showed it last week to Israeli MKs to provoke their response. I know that Gal Gadot has tried to promote Hollywood officials to watch it this Wednesday to try and promote more. I don't want to call it pro-Israel actions because I really don't think it's a pro-Israel, pro-Palestine situation, but to promote more empathy towards Israel from Hollywood's perspective. Therefore, trying to promote more, to provoke reactions, supporting Israel, so advocating for Israel's right to defend itself, and to show the horrors. I don't know if this video is going to go in more platforms. I don't think it will ever be published for the public. I don't think it should be published for the public. This is actual people that are in there. Again, that's my own personal opinion. It could be wrong. There's a lot of people saying that the world needs to see this. The world needs to see the horrors in order to understand. I will claim that if it hasn't responded already from the horrors it have seen, this is not going to change that. It's just going to hurt the people whose their families and friends are on those videos. But it is definitely important to show this as raw as it could be, especially to world leaders and people with a lot of influence over the world. Again, I don't know how this is gonna, what's the reaction that's gonna be coming after this, especially from Hollywood officials and high rank personnel. But it is definitely something that Israel hasn't done before. Usually in the past 20 years, after each attack, as we all know, Hamas invited journalists to come and film the wreckage and film the bloody images from an IDF airstrike, and Israel didn't. After every terror attack, Israel didn't publish the footages, Israel didn't show the horrors because of its respect to the victims' family and friends and for human dignity. But now it's a different situation. I know specifically that the Israel embassy has moved on from any red line it used to have in the past and just publishing everything they have. On a meeting we had with the Israeli embassy a few weeks ago, they said that they have something called the horror file, which is essentially a folder with all of the horrors. I'm assuming some of it was used for the IDF spokesperson video eventually, but they show it to world leaders. They show it to congressmen, they show it to politicians, and they show it to everybody who has some form of influence over decision making. And that's why I think it's complicated, because those two spheres do not align with each other. On a Shabbat dinner we had, I don't know if you saw, Bring Them Home organization, which is the headquarters for the family of the hostages, now host every Friday an empty Shabbat table at the mall. 2 weeks ago it was on the Lincoln Memorial. This one I think it was next to Congress. But I had a conversation with some of the hostages' families after the event, and people come to show support, and people speak about the situation and advocate for their. But they were saying that they've met with a lot of congressmen and Senate members. All of them supported Israel's right to the safe return of the hostages above ceasefire. I don't know. I don't know what will be eventually the result of this. I don't know how long it's going to take for the release of the hostages. And I don't know how long Israel can continue a war situation and continue to have, at least according to right now, support to continue its efforts in Gaza. But it's not going to be for long, unfortunately. Not because Israel's economy can withstand this, and not because world international pressure can keep it. And those two have a very, very short timeline to continue to exist, at least for now. But I hope that, at least for now, Israel has worldwide support to refuse ceasefire, to return the hostages, and to disarm Hamas. I don't know which one is on top priority, by the way. Which one is more relevant for IDF, at least. We don't seem to be getting a clear image or a clear statement from the government regarding to what are the is the destination here? What are we trying to achieve eventually? IDF personnel are all saying the same thing, to disarm Hamas, which is a very clear and current object regarding specifically in Gaza. Disarm Hamas meaning dismantle any military ability Hamas had. When it comes to a policy-making solution, when it comes to the return of the hostages, we don't have a clear response, at least for now. And this sucks. Yeah, go ahead, Jeff.
Thanks, Dean. You and I were on a briefing the other day, and we asked the question, how does Israel stand up to the international pressure for ceasefire? And the expert who was on the call said Israel can stand up to any international pressure with the exception of the United States. So if the United States advocates for a ceasefire at some point, how do you think the Israeli government will respond to that? And I have a follow-up question after you comment on that question.
You have to repeat that. I'm sorry. Didn't completely understand.
To repeat my question?
Yeah.
If there comes a time when the United States joins the other international calls for Israel to have a ceasefire, how do you think Israel will respond to that pressure from the United States?
I have no idea. And I'm entitled to answer that way because I'm not a governmental representative. But here's what I think. As in for right now, and we both saw this on the briefing, Israel's biggest advocate is the US. And Israel's only breath right now in order to continue the fight is because of the US support, both in military budgeting and military presence in the Mediterranean. We both know that there's 2 air carriers that moved. There's another nuclear submarine that moved in last night, and this is to deter other factors from joining in the fight and enables Israel to focus on Gaza and not distribute the fight into other frontiers. I'm talking about Hezbollah, I'm talking about the West Bank. We know exactly what Israel's fear is that we'll start another war in Lebanon. Israel can't afford a war in Lebanon. When it comes to the situation in Gaza, we both heard the person who says that this can hold no longer than a month, 1 more month, which means Israel will have to finish whatever it started by December, at least on the broader scale, because afterwards they might not get the support from the US as well. If it comes to a time that the US will advocate for ceasefire and Israel will continue to its ground operation in Gaza, might very well decrease in size of the attacks or might reduce the size back to a military operation rather than a full-scale war. But I'm more concerned about the question of how can the US will advocate for a ceasefire if their hostages will not be returned. And I think that this is where we have the most interesting point is if it comes to a point where the hostages has not been returned yet and the US is called for a ceasefire, I'll say that this is a different policy than the one it showed. Not just because of the fact that they are also American citizens as part of the hostages, which prevents the US, I think for the moment at least, to diminish its support, but that's a tough question, and I don't think that it's just going to be. I don't think that the Israel will be able to promote a military operation in Gaza without the U.S. support. It can definitely promote a small-scale military operation, not a full-scale war as much as we see it right now, because without the deter of the U.S. presence in the Mediterranean, which prevents Russia, Iran, Yemen or other countries, Lebanon and Syria, from engaging in the northern frontier. So this is very, very complicated. And we've also talked about this being part of like a larger event that is unfolding, which is the risk of a World War III, right? We know exactly from the resolution that you have on one side Russia, Iran, of the countries that voted against the resolution to recognize Hamas as a terror organization and to justify Israel's right to defend itself. And we saw who voted for it. We saw that the US, we saw Britain, most of the Western world countries, and Israel. And I think that this is right to an extent, from the US perspective, this could be just another pawn in a very big board, which is how do we prevent from situation to escalate in the Middle East, and not just specifically about Gaza. And that's why I don't think we'll get to the point where we don't return the hostages yet, and the US stopped its support, because if we'll get to that point, it might affect the other frontiers. I know I didn't give you a direct answer regarding to where Israel go against the US's will, because I don't think that those can really align when it comes to the situation. Again, that's my personal perspective on this. We have no idea, and every time we even try to guess what will happen next, we were we are proven very wrong regarding to how things actually ended. But we have some hand risen. So Ziv, which is my uncle, it seems like half of this Zoom is my family in it. By the way, it's their chance to see my face.
Hey, Dean, thank you for putting this together. Just a couple of comments on a couple of items that we talked about, but I'll touch first on the ceasefire, or the biggest challenge with the ceasefire or humanitarian help, which is even worse, is how can Israel allow for humanitarian help in Gaza with 240 hostages? We have no information, no humanitarian help for the 240 hostages. We don't even know if they're alive. The Red Cross has not visited them. There are older women and men who need medications urgently. There are small children without their parents, without their family, who are sitting there, their entire families that are there. Maybe, we don't know. So the whole issue of the ceasefire and any humanitarian help whatsoever, in my opinion, we should give them humanitarian help, and we can ceasefire after all 240 hostages are released. At that point, of course, we need to cease fire and we need to extend help. But with zero information on 240 of our children, our families, our grandmothers, grandfathers, I don't think we can give any help, or we can cease fire. That's one topic regarding the ceasefire. But I wanted to touch on something earlier, because we spoke about what's happening in universities in the US and across the world, actually. And I think the problem that we're seeing is, and we spoke about, somebody mentioned anti-Semitism in disguise, and indeed it's an anti-Semitism in disguise that unfortunately is coming from what here in the US we call the activist left. And the activist left is basically seeing, and they've always seen actually, Israel as a colonizing country. There's a bunch of people who are colonizing the poor Palestinians. They've taken over their land. I'm not clear what land is that, but we've taken over their land. And they see Israel basically as a racist country that is expelling Palestinians from their homes. And the worst part is that we currently have this Israeli very right-wing government. And the fact that Israel has a right-wing government makes things worse and makes things a lot more difficult. And that government is not really creating any information that is helpful. The IDF is, and we see what the IDF is doing. And if you follow the IDF, and I highly recommend you follow the IDF social media and other messages, they're doing the best they can, but I haven't seen much from the government itself. And again, I don't have a solution. I'm just pointing out some of the things that I've seen in social media, some of the things that I've seen and I've heard in different rallies that I've attended. I'm in New York, by the way, not in Virginia, but hello from New York. And a lot of the speeches and a lot of the things that we as Jews in the US are putting out, we're basically putting it out to an audience that already is sold on those thoughts. Our friends see what we say, our friends hear what we say, but we need to start speaking to people who don't see, who don't understand, who don't have the background, who don't have the information. And that's really, really difficult. So 2 different topics, very different, but I just wanted to bring that up. And thank you again, Dean.
Zena, I know you raised your hand as well, so you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm just related to the question of American support. I think that obviously not an expert on like any politics or anything, but like unlike UN, who are claiming lots of kind of good things like for peace in the world and like stuff like that, which is great, but they are not, like, every time they claim something, they're not offering any like action plan. And the United States usually like if they're claiming for something, they have an action plan. And like right now, like the only action plan is like to release hostages and to like do whatever is needed in Gaza. So like I hope like we won't even like get to a situation when the states will need to call for ceasefire, because like unless they come up with some brilliant idea that nobody came up before.
And I think, I don't know if you saw the really interesting comments coming from Zelensky, Ukraine president, saying that Hamas's attack are a part of Russia's effort to divert worldwide attention from the war in Ukraine, which is, I don't know if it was originated from that thought, but it's definitely doing it. A lot of resources, I know specifically diverted from the US military budget, was diverted from Ukraine to Israel in order for that support, because money is not
I mean, yeah, in Russian speaking community, like the day when the war started, like that was like the first thing we saw it also, like in addition to everything else. And like my personal opinion that like if Putin is attached somehow to this, that's because he wants to divert American money there and get them out of Ukraine. But I think that interestingly enough, in the like very soon after the start of the war, like at least like pro-Israel media and voices like put together Putin, Iran, and Hamas in one bucket, the like world evil, and that was actually kind of good, I think, because that is more or less right, to my opinion.
So I want to connect with Ziv's last comment and with Jeff's last comment and say we need to talk to people about this. We need to make people understand why specifically ceasefire is not something Israel can afford right now, but in more locally, why is this so complicated? And we've been encouraging people to just invite people to your home, people you know, people you might know, people you think would be finding this valuable. And if you want to have me, if you want to have Zina, if you want to have one of the other shlichim in the area to help kind of like navigate through that tough conversation, we'll do it. We found that we think that the best way possible right now to deal with the situation is to talk to people, exactly like Ziv said, not necessarily preaching to the choir, but finding people that will have this conversation in a more difficult way. Getting people together, not just to support one another, not just for the social aspect of getting people together, but also to talk about this, to understand that this is a complicated conversation and one that needs to be had with people that you trust, with people that you know, is valuable for this situation right now. And we're here to help you facilitate that conversation. If you want me on board, I will happily just come by in your house at the JCC whenever you think fits. We are advocating for it. Our best effort right now is talking to people. Whenever, and I'm keeping saying this on every single thing that I'm doing in the past few weeks. Every time I talk to people in person, on Zoom or live, whenever I'm having an honest or sincere conversation with someone, I feel encouraged. I feel empathized. I feel like they understand the situation better, that they want to help. Whether it's just talking to other people and explaining, hold on, this is not as easy as you say it is. This is not white versus black. This is not colonialist versus imperialist. This is more complicated. Or actually advocating for supportive organizations, doing stuff online, uploading content, whatever. That helps, and that encouraged me and makes me feel better. Then I open international media or I open social media and I get completely depressed. But then I go back and I meet another person. And I think this is where we should be investing our efforts in right now. And I'm sure all of us here wants to help. We can help by providing you with resources. You can definitely go to our JCC's website. We've put a lot of stuff on our Padlet and the Support Israel page. We're also going to start getting more people together, so you're more than welcome to join us. Again, keep up with our social media to find out more about this, or just reach out in person. And get people together by yourself. Invite your friends, invite your family, think people that you think will find this conversation valuable, and just talk to them. And if there's anything I can help with, whether it's being there in person or providing with resources, I am here for you for whatever reason. Yes, Jeff.
So it may be late in today's session to even broach this topic. But I know that Blinken is putting a lot of emphasis on the day after or the next day. And I'm curious whether you have an opinion about the different ideas and proposals that are starting to float around regarding governance of Gaza after Hamas is neutralized.
I just wanted to,
Yeah, go ahead, Zin. Sorry.
yeah, I just wanted to emphasize their resource page on the website that Dean mentioned. Like, I would advise everybody to bookmark this page, Stand with Israel, because we are adding their daily things, like to do meetings and other opportunities to help. Like one of them we just added and I just put it on the chat. Like that's a very useful resource of like how to call representatives in any state of the United States. So if you have friends in other states, please send it to them as well, because we need to call representatives more often and have more calls for that. Thank you.
Also, you'll find in the chat the link to the web page itself as well. And as Zina said, keep it on your bookmark because we're updating it frequently. Jeff, on the 8 minutes we have left to try and talk about the most difficult answer no one can give right now, which is what's going to happen the day after. I'm going to start with answering the way I answered most of the questions on this session. I have no idea. There's no tangible idea regarding what's going to happen next, especially from government. But we can break it down. We can look at it from what's happening right now and what is the goal that we want to achieve. Right now, as we see it, Gaza cannot continue to exist the way it exists right now, with Hamas being present in there, because people are not going to live in the south anymore, if that will happen. People will not live in the Gaza envelope. People will not live in southern cities if the threat of Hamas continue to exist, simply because of the fact that they will do it again. Hamas has viewed October 7th as a victory, and if something is successful, you want to continue doing it. They will do it again. They will try to harm more citizens, to abduct more citizens, and to take more people hostage, just because that's their way of sustaining themselves. Which means that the military operation has to come off with the complete annihilation of Hamas military abilities in Gaza. That leaves two things on the ground. The first one is Gaza residents who are very, very unstable. First off, because we don't know, you can't really tell if someone is a Hamas advocate or not, if he is not carrying anything that can harm people. You cannot invest in people's emotions, and you cannot see what they feel. And the second thing is Gaza in wreckage. That's going to need a lot of aid in order to restore. Which means that in that vacuum, that will be after Hamas's at least military ability goal. We don't know about their other factions of Hamas that will still continue to exist and going to take years to eliminate completely. Hamas's idea is going to remain in Gaza. What you have there is citizens that have just been threatened by Hamas or advocated by Hamas and were bombed by the IDF. That's the people in Gaza that you see. And you have to find a solution to that. One possible solution is to get the Palestinian Authority in Gaza, which is the most, I'll say, practical solution in terms of the minimum effort and the maximum effect. And I don't know how much that will actually be effective because the Palestinian Authority is losing legitimacy in the West Bank to Hamas. Whenever we see a weakening happening in the Palestinian Authority, we see a strengthening of Hamas entity in it. And that doesn't change the fact that you also have a lot of residents that were indoctrinated to hate Jews and to hate Israelis. And that's going to remain as well. We'll see the Palestinian Authority as an entity that collaborates with Israel. They might view them as the enemy, just as much as the Hamas does. And that is very, very difficult. That is something so difficult, no one has an actual idea how to deal with. Some of them might try to rise as another form. If we're done with Hamas, it's going to be jihad. If we're done with jihad, it might be another faction of Hezbollah. If it's not Hezbollah, it's going to be El-Qassam. It's very, very hard to see what actually happens to the residents. And the Palestinian Authority is not necessarily the right call, but I don't see any other call coming in to help. Regarding international support, whether Egypt, Jordan, or other big Arabic Islamic countries like Saudi Arabia, United Emirates, or even Qatar, which funded Hamas, are going to actually be involved in this? I don't think so. Simply because they haven't been involved until now. They don't give a crap about the Palestinians. They don't want to deal with them just as much as Israel doesn't want to deal with them. Jordan is dealing with Palestinian refugees for 50 years. It tried to eradicate all Palestinian refugees after they tried to reign over the rule of Jordan kingdomship. The mass massacre of refugees camps in Jordan, but Palestinian refugees still continue to exist in Jordan now, and they still don't get along with the Jordanian government. So goes in Lebanon. They don't want to deal with Palestinian refugees, and that is difficult. Trying to promote this as a two-state solution and give Gaza to be part of the Palestinian Authority and then try to give them more authority is not something Israel can afford itself right now. To let more freedom of arms to Palestinians right now is going to cause in more dead Israelis because the legitimacy for a peace solution right now doesn't exist, both from the Palestinian and the Israeli side. I have an extreme idea in mind, and this is something we've discussed briefly. And I also say that we're living in an extreme environment in which, in that case, every solution is viable. But exchange of territories might be a solution. I don't know if someone will actually try to promote that or not, but Israel conquering Gaza, Israel taking Gaza, occupying it to be part of its land, but giving away some of the C or B territories in the West Bank in exchange for that to the Palestinian authorities, moving all the refugees that have already been evacuated from their homes in the Gaza Strip in order to create a one cohesive West Bank for the Palestinians, and then try to promote a more, I don't know if a peace resolution, but at least to get to some form of an agreement. Give Israel more security than it has right now. This is very, very difficult, and it is going to harm Israel's legitimacy worldwide because eventually what's the world going to see is Israel evacuating Gaza residents from their homes. And also, in addition to the right-wing government we have right now, giving back territories is not something they will allow. Again, as I said, this is an extreme solution. This is what I believe could be the proper solution to this problem, but it's very, very far from being tangible. There's no strategy in the Middle East. I'm not the first one to say it. There's only tactics. And it's because everything is so unstable, you can't really plan for the long run. You have to react and you have to look for the what's happening right now. But we're out of time, and I'm going to be respectful of your time. So, Jeff, I'm sorry I gave you the short answer for your question. I want to thank you all again for joining in this Zoom. I want to encourage you to be proactive. Go visit our webpage, continue to support Israel, and meet people, talk to people, have us coming to talk to people, use us with whatever you need as resources for you to help Israel right now. Have a great week. I'm really happy to see you all, and I wish to see you all again on next Monday.